You probably know by now that Ripple, which is the company behind XRP, was founded in 2012. But what if I told you that Ripple's history dates back all the way to 2004, 4 years before Bitcoin's white paper was released? Would you believe me? Press that like button and let's find out. In 2004, long before the idea of Bitcoin existed, a web developer named Ryan Fugger was working on a concept in Vancouver, Canada. His goal was not to create a global cryptocurrency. Instead, he wanted to build a system that would allow people to create their own credit and exchange value within local communities. That project became known as RipplePay. It was a peer-to-peer payment platform that allowed users to send assets to one another and track balances, functioning like a shared ledger between trusted friends or neighbors. This was well before blockchains became established. There was no mining, no tokens, and no XRP. What made RipplePay important was the underlying idea. It introduced the concept of a decentralized network for exchanging value, one that did not rely on banks or large financial institutions, but on direct relationships. That idea, although simple, became the first foundation of what would later evolve into the XRP Ledger. This original version of Ripple was small and local, but the vision behind it was much broader. That vision drew the attention of people who were already thinking about building something larger, faster, and more competitive with Bitcoin. That is where the next part of the story begins. Before moving on, let me welcome you to the XRP Club, your #1 place for everything related to XRP. If you want fact-based XRP analysis and regular updates, hit that subscribe button and turn notifications on so you can get informed whenever a new video is released. Now that we know how the idea was created, let's move on to 2011 and explore a period where XRP we all know today was born. While RipplePay continued to exist quietly as a small experimental platform, a new group of cryptographic engineers began working on ways to address some of Bitcoin's main limitations. Among them were David Schwartz, Jed McCaleb, and Arthur Britto. They saw promise in blockchain technology, but they also saw weaknesses in Bitcoin's design, including slow transaction speeds and its heavy dependence on mining, which consumes large amounts of energy. Their view was that a better system could be built. Rather than copying Bitcoin, they designed a new ledger from the ground up. It would still rely on cryptography and decentralized consensus, but without mining or proof of work. Their goal was to create a digital asset system that was faster, more scalable, and more energy efficient. That system became the XRP Ledger, which officially launched on June 2nd, 2012. From the beginning, the XRP Ledger was built for speed and efficiency. Transactions could settle within seconds, and the system could process far more traffic than Bitcoin or Ethereum at the time. One of the most significant elements of the launch was the introduction of its native digital currency, XRP. Unlike Bitcoin, which is mined over time, the full supply of 100 billion XRP was created at once in what is commonly described as pre-mined. Of those 100 billion tokens, 20 billion were distributed among the 3 creators. The remaining 80 billion were transferred to a new company that would be formed shortly afterward, a company that would take the technology onto the global stage. Even at this early stage, the arrangement drew criticism. Some in the crypto industry were uneasy with so much XRP being concentrated in the hands of the founders and the single central entity. Even so, the XRP Ledger was live, functional, and technically advanced compared with its peers. This was no longer a small community IOU network. It had become a fully operational blockchain built for enterprise-level use. Although the launch was relatively quiet, the XRP Ledger was about to become one of the most widely discussed platforms in crypto. Before we move on, I want you to know that if you dedicate yourself to watch this video until the end, you will know more about XRP than 99% of people. Alright, getting back to video. After the XRP Ledger was launched successfully, the next step was to build a company around it. That happened in 2012 with the founding of OpenCoin, which would later be rebranded as Ripple Labs. The company was co-founded by Chris Larsen and Jed McCaleb, 2 figures who played central roles in shaping its early direction. Larsen came from a background in finance and fintech, while McCaleb was already known for creating the file-sharing platform eDonkey and later the crypto exchange Mt. Gox. Ripple Labs took a very different approach from much of the crypto industry at the time. While Bitcoin was built around decentralization and the idea of avoiding banks altogether, Ripple chose to work with financial institutions. Its goal was to modernize the infrastructure behind global payments, especially cross-border transactions, which have long been known for being slow and expensive. Rather than replacing the existing system entirely, Ripple aimed to improve it from within by using the speed and efficiency of the XRP Ledger. One of Ripple's early strategic decisions was to retain most of the XRP supply. As mentioned earlier, 80 billion XRP tokens were transferred to the company after the ledger was launched. That reserve would later become an important tool, allowing Ripple to fund development, attract partners, and expand its ecosystem. At the same time, it drew strong criticism from those who believed that such large holdings gave the company too much influence over what was presented as a decentralized cryptocurrency. Ripple Labs moved quickly. With the XRP Ledger as its foundation and XRP as its native asset, the company began developing products intended to address real-world financial problems. One of its first targets was the outdated messaging system used by banks for international transfers, known as SWIFT. That system depends on intermediaries and often takes days to process payments. Ripple's objective was to replace it with instant, low-cost settlement powered by XRP. By the end of 2012, Ripple Labs had established itself as a serious presence in the blockchain industry. It was not focused on hype or speculative trading. It was building infrastructure, practical tools for banks and financial institutions with clear use cases. Very few crypto companies were pursuing that approach at the time. That enterprise-focused strategy would later define Ripple's identity in the crypto space and set the stage for both its largest successes and its biggest controversies. This great environment would face problematic challenges sooner than you think. That brings us to our next topic. In 2013, just a year after Ripple Labs was founded, the company reached an important turning point. It had promising technology, a growing team, and ambitious goals. But internal tensions were beginning to emerge. One of the earliest challenges came from within, as differences in vision among the co-founders became more pronounced. Jed McCaleb, one of the original figures behind the XRP Ledger, began to clash with the direction the company was taking. He held a more open source, decentralized view, while others, including Chris Larsen, were focused on building enterprise-ready infrastructure that could work with major banks. These disagreements were not only philosophical, they involved core questions about how much control Ripple should have over the XRP supply, how quickly the company should expand, and what kinds of partnerships it should pursue. In 2013, McCaleb ultimately chose to leave the company. Before doing so, he signed a legal agreement that would affect the XRP market for years. The agreement limited how much XRP he could sell over time in order to avoid market disruption. Because his holdings were substantial, those controlled sales became a source of controversy in the years that followed. After his departure, McCaleb went on to launch a new project, Stellar, or XLM, which shared some similarities with Ripple, but placed greater emphasis on decentralization and open access. It was a clear indication that the philosophical divide between these two approaches to crypto was not going away. At the same time, Ripple was raising its first round of funding. Investors saw potential in the company's approach to improving cross-border payments, and that early capital gave Ripple the resources to expand its team and continue developing its product suite. Even with investor support, however, the company was facing growing public skepticism. Some in the crypto community viewed Ripple's large XRP holdings and leadership structure as too centralized for what they considered a truly trustless ecosystem. Ripple continued to move forward. Despite the internal conflict and the criticism, the technology was solid and the mission remained clear. By the end of 2013, Ripple had raised millions, gone through its first major internal shakeup, and begun to distinguish itself as a blockchain company focused on real-world utility rather than speculation. It was a turbulent period, but also a defining one. The departure of a co-founder, the launch of a rival project, and the first major funding round all helped shape Ripple's path forward. What followed was a sustained period of product development, partnerships, and gradual growth. That growth is what brings us to topic number 5, After the internal turbulence of 2013, Ripple entered a critical phase between 2014 and 2016. These years did not generate headlines in the way that later price surges or lawsuits would, but they laid the foundation for Ripple's future development. This was the period in which the company's ideas began to take shape as working products, and new financial partnerships started to influence how money could move across borders. Ripple's team focused heavily on building infrastructure. Rather than becoming absorbed in the growing speculation surrounding other cryptocurrencies, the company concentrated on utility. Its early product roadmap began to take shape around three core offerings: XCurrent, XRapid, and XVIA. These were not simply branded concepts. They were designed to address practical problems faced by banks and remittance providers, including slow settlement, high transaction costs, and limited interoperability across systems. XCurrent allowed banks to communicate and confirm payment details in real time. It did not require XRP, but it established the trust and messaging framework that made cross-border transfers more efficient. XRapid followed, using XRP as a bridge currency to settle transactions instantly at low cost. XVIA was designed to connect different payment networks, allowing businesses to integrate with RippleNet more easily and send money globally without needing separate integrations for each destination. Products, however, are only as useful as the institutions willing to adopt them. This is where Ripple began to gain momentum. During this period, the company signed agreements with a number of early adopting institutions. Banks such as Fugger in Germany, Cross River in the United States, and financial services firms such as Earthport began testing or implementing Ripple's technology. These were not isolated trials. They were early signs that Ripple's approach could find a place within the traditional financial system. Those partnerships helped Ripple build credibility. It was no longer just a crypto startup. It had become a financial technology company working directly with banks to improve settlement infrastructure. That mattered because in a sector often driven by hype and short-term gains, Ripple was showing that long-term strategy could produce tangible results. By 2016, Ripple had positioned itself as one of the few blockchain companies with live products, real clients, and a growing network. XRP was still not widely used, but the infrastructure was being put in place. When the crypto market expanded again, Ripple was positioned to respond not only with a vision, but with a system that had already been under development for years. That market explosion came sooner than many expected, bringing us to our next topic. As 2017 began, the cryptocurrency market was gaining momentum, and Ripple was well positioned to benefit from it. Years of development, strategic partnerships, and infrastructure building were beginning to show results. While many cryptocurrencies rose during this period, largely on hype, XRP's rise was supported by tangible progress. Ripple's business model was maturing, and its technology was being tested in live financial environments. This was not simply a sudden surge. It reflected years of preparation coming together at a favorable moment. At the center of Ripple's growth was RippleNet, a network of banks and financial institutions that could communicate and settle payments using Ripple's products. By early 2017, dozens of pilot programs were underway. Banks and remittance providers were no longer only exploring the technology. They were running tests, executing transactions, and demonstrating that Ripple's system could function in real-world conditions. As more institutions joined, confidence in Ripple's long-term potential increased. What drew the most public attention, however, was XRP. At the start of 2017, it was trading for less than 1 cent. Within months, that changed sharply. As the broader crypto market rose, XRP followed, reaching a peak of $3.84 in early January 2018. It was one of the most significant price increases in crypto history and brought XRP into the center of public attention. For a brief period, XRP overtook Ethereum in market capitalization, making it the second largest cryptocurrency in the world behind Bitcoin. No other coin besides XRP has done that. While much of the crypto industry was driven by promises and white papers, Ripple stood out by offering something more concrete. The company was not only presenting ideas, it had real clients running real pilot programs on real infrastructure. That distinction brought attention from both investors and the financial sector. The rise, however, also drew criticism. Some question the relationship between Ripple as a company and XRP as an asset. Ripple could sell software to banks without requiring them to use XRP. That led to an important question. Was XRP's price supported by actual utility, or was it moving with the same speculative wave that affected the rest of the market during the bull cycle? Despite those concerns, the outcome was clear. By the end of 2017, Ripple had established itself as a major force not only in crypto, but in the broader discussion about the future of finance. It had working products, prominent partners, and one of the most valuable digital assets in the market. That rapid rise created new opportunities, but it also brought new scrutiny. As market boom cooled down, Ripple entered a much more difficult period. In 2018, Ripple and XRP faced a basic test. Could they hold up outside the excitement of a bull market? After reaching a historic peak, the price of XRP fell sharply, not because the project had failed, but because the broader crypto market was undergoing a correction. This was the point at which hype alone was no longer enough. Every blockchain project was confronted with the same question. Did it have real-world staying power? Ripple's response was to continue building. While XRP declined along with the wider market, the company kept expanding its international presence. Rather than chasing headlines, Ripple focused on growth behind the scenes. One of the most important developments was the official launch of XRapid, a liquidity solution that used XRP to bridge currencies in real-time, cross-border payments. XRapid had been in testing for years, but in 2018, it began moving into commercial use. That mattered because it gave XRP a clearer role in practice. Ripple was not only offering blockchain software, it was developing a product that depended on the token to provide speed and cost savings. For those who questioned XRP's purpose, this represented visible progress toward integrating it into real financial workflows. That did not mean the doubts disappeared. Criticism intensified. One of the central concerns was Ripple's large XRP holdings. With billions of tokens held in escrow and released on a monthly basis, some in the crypto community argued that Ripple had too much control over the token supply. In their view, that made XRP less decentralized than it should be. Others pointed out that banks using RippleNet were not necessarily using XRP, which raised further questions about the asset's long-term demand. Despite that criticism, Ripple continued signing deals. The company opened new offices in regions such as the Middle East and Asia, secured high-profile partnerships, and continued onboarding clients to RippleNet. That international expansion helped Ripple remain relevant, even as many crypto projects faded during the bear market. By the end of 2018, XRP was still one of the largest cryptocurrencies by market capitalization. It had lost much of its price momentum, but the underlying business continued to grow. Ripple's focus on enterprise use and real-world utility had helped it withstand the downturn, even as debate over its decentralization and long-term model continued. This year marked a turning point. The hype of 2017 had faded, but Ripple was still standing. Before we continue, let me congratulate you for making it over half of today's video and encourage you to stay until the end. Knowledge is something that gives you edge over others in the world of cryptocurrencies. Let's all comment down below with the hashtag XRPArmy and support each other. Now, without wasting more time, let's move towards the next topic. 2019 began with cautious optimism. The crypto winter had cooled speculation, but for Ripple, the groundwork laid in previous years was beginning to produce visible results. One of the most significant developments in this period was the way Ripple chose to manage its XRP supply. In response to ongoing concerns about centralization, the company moved to build trust by locking 55 billion XRP in escrow. This was not a one-time decision. Ripple introduced a system under which 1 billion tokens would be released each month, creating a predictable and transparent schedule. The goal was straightforward: reduce market uncertainty and reassure partners that XRP supply would not suddenly flood the market. That was not the only major development. Ripple's global partnerships were also expanding quickly. The company had become active in Latin America, the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia Pacific, regions where cross-border payments often face high friction and significant costs. One of the most widely discussed deals came when Ripple partnered with MoneyGram, a major company in the remittance sector. The partnership used XRP for liquidity through what was then known as XRapid, later renamed On-Demand Liquidity, or ODL. This was an important milestone for Ripple's strategy. Rather than simply promoting concepts, the company was bringing major financial institutions into live environments that used XRP. ODL allowed MoneyGram to remove the need for pre-funded accounts in destination countries. Instead of holding capital in foreign banks, XRP could be used to source local currencies almost instantly. That was the kind of efficiency Ripple had been describing for years, and it was now being implemented at scale. It was no longer only a proposal, it had become operational. Despite that progress, 2020 would become a more complicated year. The crypto market began to recover, and interest in blockchain increased again. Ripple's position as one of the most established companies in the sector gave it momentum. At the same time, regulatory uncertainty in the United States was becoming a growing risk. Ripple continued to operate in a legal gray area, particularly around the question of whether XRP should be classified as a security. The company pushed for clearer rules, but government agencies provided little guidance. Even so, business development continued. RippleNet kept expanding, and ODL transactions showed a noticeable increase in volume. New corridors opened in the Philippines, Mexico, and other emerging markets. Ripple also made strategic investments in blockchain startups and payment platforms to broaden its ecosystem further. The company's focus was clearly international, especially in regions where regulation was more favorable and blockchain adoption was moving faster. However, just as conditions appeared to be stabilizing, the end of 2020 brought one of the most serious challenges Ripple had ever faced. That brings us to the next topic. In December 2020, just days before the year ended, Ripple was hit with a lawsuit that shook the crypto industry. The significance came not only from the allegations themselves, but from the agency behind them. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, filed a formal complaint against Ripple Labs, its chief executive Brad Garlinghouse, and co-founder Chris Larsen. The allegation was that Ripple had conducted an unregistered securities offering through the sale of XRP. This was not a minor claim. The SEC argued that XRP, the asset around which Ripple had built its business for years, was in fact a security, and that Ripple's sales of XRP, going back to its early years, had violated federal law. According to the SEC, Ripple had raised more than $1.3 billion through those sales, without registering XRP as a security or seeking an exemption. The effect was immediate. Within hours, XRP's price fell sharply, dropping below $0.20. That was only the beginning. US-based exchanges moved quickly. Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, and many others suspended or fully delisted XRP trading, particularly for US customers. An asset that had once reached the number 2 position in global crypto rankings was suddenly at risk of disappearing from American markets altogether. This was not only a blow to the token, it was a direct threat to Ripple's broader business model. The financial infrastructure, partnerships, and systems the company had built over the years were now facing legal uncertainty. If XRP were ruled to be a security, the consequences would extend far beyond Ripple. The case could set a precedent for how other digital assets would be classified and regulated. Ripple denied the allegations. The company argued that XRP was not a security and maintained that it had always operated transparently. Brad Garlinghouse stated publicly that the lawsuit was misguided and that Ripple would challenge it in court. In the months that followed, the legal battle intensified. Both sides filed motions, released documents, and prepared for what would become the most closely watched court case in crypto. What was at stake was not only Ripple's future, but potentially the broader regulatory framework for the crypto industry in the United States. At the same time, Ripple's international operations continued. As US exchanges pulled back, many global partners kept using RippleNet and ODL. Ripple leaned further into overseas markets, arguing that the lawsuit showed how badly the United States needed clearer crypto regulation. But the damage had already been done. XRP's public image had taken a major hit. Its availability had been restricted. Its legitimacy was now under intense legal scrutiny. What had once been a rising force in crypto was now fighting for survival in court. But to everyone's surprise, this wasn't the end of XRP's story. Quite the opposite. What came next would surprise everyone. In 2021, only months after the SEC lawsuit, many expected Ripple to retreat or struggle under the pressure. That did not happen. Instead, the company made a decisive shift. Rather than remaining centered on the regulatory fight in the United States, Ripple turned outward and reinforced its global strategy. With much of the US crypto industry constrained by regulatory uncertainty, Ripple chose to focus on markets that were more open to its technology. International expansion became a central priority. The company accelerated the growth of on-demand liquidity, the product that uses XRP to settle cross-border payments across new corridors. Markets such as the Philippines, Mexico, and the UAE saw significant growth as local partners adopted RippleNet and XRP-based settlement. This was not only a matter of survival, it was also a demonstration that Ripple's technology could continue to advance even while the US market remained uncertain. Financial institutions in those regions were focused primarily on results, and Ripple was offering faster payments, lower costs, and a more efficient process than many legacy banking systems. One of the most notable developments during this period came from a different direction: central banks. As governments around the world began exploring central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs, Ripple offered its infrastructure as a possible foundation. In 2021, the company launched pilot programs with two sovereign entities, the Royal Monetary Authority of Bhutan and the Republic of Palau. In Bhutan, Ripple partnered with the central bank to explore how the XRP Ledger could support a digital ngultrum, Bhutan's local currency, with the goal of improving financial inclusion and payment efficiency. In Palau, the focus was on developing a USD-backed digital currency, again, using Ripple's technology, though not relying directly on XRP. In the United States, the legal dispute continued. Internationally, however, Ripple was reshaping its path. By concentrating on regions that were more receptive to blockchain innovation, the company not only remained operational, but expanded. The number of ODL corridors increased, transaction volumes rose, RippleNet connected more institutions, and XRP remained central to that growing infrastructure. By the end of 2022, Ripple had demonstrated that it could continue moving forward without waiting for regulatory clarity in the United States. While others paused, Ripple kept building. In doing so, it kept XRP active, relevant, and integrated into real-world financial operations, not through hype, but through practical use. That is what made this period so important. It showed that even under legal and regulatory pressure, Ripple could adjust, develop, and expand internationally. And speaking about that, we arrive to our next topic. On July 13, 2023, one of the most important moments in XRP's history took place, not only because of the decision itself, but because of what it made clear. After nearly 3 years of legal uncertainty, U.S. District Judge Annalisa Torres issued a landmark ruling in the Ripple versus SEC case. The ruling was that XRP is not a security, at least not when sold on public exchanges. This marked a significant shift. For the first time, a U.S. federal court drew a distinction between the way a digital asset is sold and whether it qualifies as a security under American law. The court found that programmatic sales of XRP, meaning transactions involving everyday users on public crypto platforms, did not violate securities laws. That was a major result for Ripple and sent shockwaves through the industry. Only a small number of companies have survived an SEC lawsuit, and even fewer have succeeded in court. The ruling, however, was not absolute. Judge Torres also found that XRP could be considered a security when sold directly to institutional investors under certain conditions. So the outcome was not a complete win on every point, but it was enough to restore momentum to Ripple and, more importantly, confidence in XRP's future. The market reacted immediately. Within hours of the decision, XRP's price surged by more than 70% in a single day. Exchanges that had previously distanced themselves from the token began to reverse course. Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, and others relisted XRP, signaling that regulatory risk, at least for retail trading, had been significantly reduced. This moment was about more than price movement or exchange listings. It was about legal validation. For years, Ripple had argued that XRP was not a security and that the SEC's case represented regulatory overreach. The ruling supported much of that position and gave the crypto industry a new legal reference point. It was the first substantial clarity from a US court on how digital assets could be classified depending on the context of their sale, something projects and investors had been seeking from regulators for years. As the legal uncertainty began to ease, Ripple shifted its focus again. The company increased its engagement with financial institutions, regulators, and developers. It used that legal momentum to rebuild XRP's credibility and accelerate adoption of its technologies. At the same time, global discussions about crypto regulation increasingly referred to the Ripple case as a turning point, evidence that courts could provide more balanced and nuanced guidance than regulatory agencies. By the end of 2023, XRP had returned to the center of attention. It was not only a digital asset with practical utility, but also a symbol of the crypto industry's evolving legal framework. It had gone through one of the most significant regulatory battles in the sector and emerged more defined and more tested than before. This was not just a partial victory. It marked the beginning of a new phase, one in which XRP was no longer only the asset under legal pressure, but also the asset that helped define the legal boundaries for the future of crypto in the United States. It was time for a clear path of evolution, which brings us to our next topic. As the legal uncertainty began to ease, Ripple moved quickly. By late 2023 and into 2024, the company shifted its focus toward growth and innovation. The XRP Ledger, once central to the SEC legal battle, was again drawing attention for different reasons. What followed was a visible transformation, not only in Ripple's business model, but in the XRP ecosystem itself. This period was not about defending the past, it was about defining the future. One of the first major developments was the XRP Ledger's support for native NFTs. After years of watching Ethereum dominate the NFT sector, despite higher fees and slower transaction speeds, developers on the XRPL began introducing functionality that allowed users to mint, trade, and interact with NFTs directly on the ledger. There were no smart contract workarounds and no external dependencies, only fast, efficient, native NFT capabilities built into the core protocol. This was significant, not only from a technical standpoint, but also symbolically. It showed that XRP was not limited to a payments-only role. It could evolve and compete in emerging sectors such as digital ownership, art, and tokenized assets. The XRP Ledger also introduced sidechain support. This gave developers a way to experiment with new features, applications, and use cases without affecting the main network's performance or security. These sidechains open the door to areas ranging from DeFi applications to regulated asset issuance, giving the XRPL a level of flexibility it had not previously had. Then came hooks, lightweight functions similar to smart contracts being developed for the XRP Ledger. This was one of the most anticipated innovations. Although not as complex as Ethereum smart contracts, hooks allowed developers to add logic directly to XRPL accounts, opening the way for automated payments, on-ledger voting, and many other use cases. In practical terms, the XRP Ledger was becoming programmable. These upgrades were not happening in isolation. At the same time, Ripple was pushing adoption more aggressively than before. By early 2024, its on-demand liquidity, or ODL, was being used across more than 40 global corridors. That meant real payments moving in real time across dozens of countries using XRP. Ripple also expanded its grant programs and developer outreach. The XRPL Grants Initiative, along with partnerships in the DeFi and NFT sectors, helped grow a strong community of builders. Independent developers, startups, and financial institutions were now engaging with the XRP Ledger not only because of Ripple, but because of what the technology itself was capable of doing. All right, we almost made it to present time. Let's dive straight inside our next topic. By 2024, Ripple had clearly moved into a new phase, and this phase looked very different from the old story where everything revolved around one lawsuit. The legal battle with the SEC did not vanish overnight, but the shape of the outcome became much clearer. Judge Annalisa Torres had already ruled in 2023 The XRP itself was not a security when sold on public exchanges, while certain institutional sales by Ripple did violate securities law. Then, in August 2024, the court imposed a $125 million civil penalty on Ripple. After more back and forth, the case finally moved toward closure in 2025, with the SEC announcing a settlement framework in May, and by August 2025, both sides had ended their appeals, effectively closing the main legal chapter that had hung over XRP since late 2020. That mattered because Ripple was no longer spending all of its energy defending its survival. It could go back to building, and build it did. In late 2024, Ripple launched RLUSD, its own dollar-backed stablecoin, first on the XRP Ledger and Ethereum. Then, in 2025, Ripple integrated RLUSD into Ripple Payments, showing that the company was no longer thinking only in terms of XRP as a bridge asset, but more broadly in terms of digital asset infrastructure for institutions. That same year, Ripple announced a $1.25 billion acquisition of Hidden Road, later completed in October 2025, giving it a prime brokerage arm and pushing the company deeper into institutional finance. At the network level, the XRPL also kept evolving. Native NFTs were already live. The XRPL EVM sidechain reached mainnet in June 2025, and Ripple said its payments network had surpassed $70 billion in processed volume with coverage across more than 90 payout markets. USDC also launched natively on the XRPL in June 2025, which strengthened the idea that the ledger was becoming a broader settlement and tokenization platform, not just the home of XRP. So by the end of 2025, XRP was still one of the largest crypto assets in the market, but the more important point was this: Ripple was no longer just an XRP company. It was becoming a full-scale digital finance infrastructure company. All right, we made it to current time. Let's break it down. Where does XRP stand in 2026? The honest answer is that XRP now sits in a much stronger position than it did during the darkest years of the SEC case. But its future still depends on execution, not mythology. The legal cloud is far lighter than before. Ripple has expanded its payments business. RLUSD has grown to roughly $1.5 billion in market value by March 2026. And the XRPL ecosystem has kept adding builders through grants, accelerators, and developer programs that have supported nearly 200 projects since 2021. That gives XRP something many crypto assets still struggle to prove: actual infrastructure, actual products, and actual institutional relevance. But none of that means the future is guaranteed. It simply means XRP has survived long enough to enter its next real test. What happens next will likely depend on three major battles. The first is whether Ripple can keep turning payments, custody, stablecoins, and brokerage services into a connected business where XRP still has a meaningful role. The second is whether the XRPL can attract enough developers and useful applications to compete in a world full of Ethereum, Solana, stablecoins, tokenized assets, and central bank digital currency experiments. The EVM sidechain helps here because it gives XRPL access to Ethereum-style smart contract development, which could pull in more builders if adoption continues. The third battle is narrative. XRP has always lived in tension between two identities. One side sees it as a serious infrastructure asset for global finance. The other side treats it like a speculative symbol that will magically replace the entire banking system by next Tuesday, which is nonsense dressed in shiny armor. The realistic path is not world domination. The realistic path is that XRP keeps growing if it remains useful inside payments, liquidity, tokenization, and cross-chain finance. If Ripple keeps expanding and the XRPL keeps becoming more programmable and more widely used, XRP could remain one of the most important utility-driven assets in crypto. But if competitors solve the same problems more effectively, then XRP will need more than history and loyal community support. It will need fresh proof, and that, strangely enough, is the healthiest place XRP has been in for years. No longer trapped in court, no longer running only on hype, but finally being judged by whether it can deliver. And with that, We have reached the end of XRP's long and fascinating history. You now understand how XRP evolved from an early idea before Bitcoin into one of the most discussed and battle-tested assets in crypto. Make sure to click one of the 2 videos on your screen now, because they will help you keep building your XRP knowledge even further. Also, do not forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.